technology is rooted in ideology. One of the big misunderstandings of the internet is it suddenly came along, this miracle, this religious miracle that was granted to us because we were such good human beings. Or, maybe we behaved ourselves one day, so we got it as a Christmas present. It's absolute nonsense.
So let's talk a little bit about how one comes to the design of the internet. This wasn't something that you woke up one morning and said, aha, I know how to build the internet.
The internet has a cultural and a very concrete cultural ideological context. It represents the fusion of the old military-industrial complex of Southern California and the hippie ethic of Northern California.
The web's democratic in one way and distinctly undemocratic in another way, and I think a lot of the confusion about the political ramifications have to do with that one word having so many meanings.
The internet itself reflects a hostility towards authority. So the internet is an edge technology. It has no center. It's no coincidence then that it reflects the ideology of the people who invented it, the people who drove it.
In the 20th century, if you had something to say in public, you couldn't, period, right?
It became more and more apparent that the internet's style of operation was the antithesis of what most countries had been accustomed to. In fact, in the early days of telephony and telegraphy, there was only one network, and it was often managed by and operated by the government, giving it substantial control. So I rather liked the idea that the internet didn't have that, let me call it, deficiency, and therefore opened a platform up. It's probably the most democratic opportunity for people to express themselves and to get information than has ever existed.
The social web can do more good in the world than it can do bad. And it's the choice of people and the people who are using it as to what they want to do with it. It is the most empowering generational shift that has ever happened.
The rise of the Chinese public opinion only sort of emerges as a real power in the last few years, when the Chinese internet users base getting large enough.
So it's democratic in that it quite literally delivers power to the people. It essentially opens up participation in the public sphere. So in that sense, the word democratic, the web has been this huge increase in the participatory logic of the media environment.
It's a double-edged sword. Newspapers are an authoritarian regime's worst enemy. So what happens when an authoritarian regime comes to power? They close down all the newspapers. They take over all the TV and the radio stations. Look what happened in Iran. You had this groundswell of popular support expressed on Twitter, for example, and through blogs. It was just crushed. And the regime, Ahmadinejad, began using Twitter against his opponents very effectively, spreading horrendous lies and misinformation, bites of misinformation by the thousands.
When I look at whether social technologies and the social web is a good thing or a bad thing, if it's horrible for society or wonderful for society, I think the reality is that it's here. It's not going away. And so it's up to people who use it to decide whether it is going to represent the best of human nature or the worst of human nature. And realistically, it's probably going to be a little bit of both.
If by democracy, though, you don't just mean engagement and participation and availability to be part of the public sphere, but you mean the contending of political ideas in such a way that an outcome is reached and it balances the rights of the minority with the rights of the majority, the web is not democratic at all.
What you have with the internet is a world on the one hand where a lot of young men, and they tend to be young men, spout a lot of nonsense in my view about democratization and egalitarianism and the opening up of everything. On the other hand, these young men are becoming infinitely rich and powerful.
The kind of democratic structures you need, things like everybody gets to vote, but each person only gets one vote, we can't even tell who anybody is. So we have no way of saying we can be sure we're being fair in counting votes, right? And so what you get in the web is all of the contending of special interest that you expect in a democracy, but you don't get many of the mechanisms for defending the overall process or outcome from those special interests. So the big question around the Obama administration was, will he govern like he campaigned? Will the Obama administration show the same zeal for public input and participation that the Obama campaign did? So the day after the election, they announced change.gov, right? And they invite people in to tell the Obama administration what issues they should care about. And number one issue, right, it rises to the top of the charts, the thing that really, in the middle of 2 wars and the biggest financial meltdown in 70 years, the thing the Obama administration should most focus on is medical marijuana, right? The ability of people to smoke marijuana in their own homes for medical reasons if they want. And you think, if there's not a poll you could have commissioned that would have come to that answer. The reason that that was at the top of the list wasn't that that's what a majority of citizens wanted. Rather, it was because the people who wanted that thing were the most organized, and they were able to get their message out to people who care about, our absurd war on drugs, in order to push this issue to the top. So there's real signal there, right? There's a group of people who care passionately about this issue, but it's not the same as a vote, right? And that's, I think, the enormous tension we face right now. In the American context, this is a kind of a Madisonian moment. We wrote our Constitution down, so we had a fairly different attitude towards political discourse. I mean, maybe you all will do it in the next couple of years, but Madison was the great framer of the Constitution, and he was the person who most worked out the idea that you can never get rid of special interest, you can never get rid of factualization. In a way, democracy is for creating a playing field and a set of rules for factions to contend with each other. So the web is really good at factualization and special interests and empowering people to have incredibly loud arguments all hours of the day and night. But it's not at all good at figuring out of the massive signal that argument generates what any group of people should do. And that's because that second thing isn't a technological problem. So the technologies enabled this incredible conversation, but the kinds of tools that allow you to look at that conversation and say, this part we're going to take as advice for the government, and that part we're going to regard as the conversation that led to the advice, but we're not going to act on. To decide between deliberation and decision, you can't have a technological solution for that. And we don't yet have the political overlay that says this newly broadened and crazily fractious public sphere is also going to become politically critical in ways that, we accord to voting or jury duty or any of the other kinds of formal government mechanisms we're used to.
But I think it's very important for people to understand that the internet, with its absence of a center, with its obsession with the edge, is not coincidental. It reflects values. And technology can never be detached from values. Technology reflects human beings. Human beings don't reflect technology.
I think the web will really take on the contours of what culture has always been. There'll be hierarchies, there'll be elites, because we live in a democratic, vigorous society. There will be many doors open to people. Democracy, the democratic vitality will still rule American culture, but there will be the same restrictions, the same exclusive niches that there have always been. There may be more, there may be fewer of them. That remains to be seen. Regarding
to internet censorship, there are several of those China's unique phenomena. One is called 50 Cents blogger or 50 Cents party. What it is the government has paid, trained those what they call internet commentators, which are essentially some a government paid people that go online to spin the online opinion or expressing the messages, giving the messages of government saying, but without their real identity. they pretend to be the ordinary netizens, but they are there in the government term, quote, quote, influencing the public opinion. But there are so many of them in a different level, different government agencies hire them for their own PR purposes, and they all together get a nickname by Chinese netizens, 50 cents bloggers. It's making fun of each of them working so hard that each of their posts only worth 50 cents. But this is a real Chinese online phenomena.
In the American tradition, protections for anonymous speech are pretty solidly entrenched in First Amendment law. And in a way, the ability to speak and be heard separate from your identity is important, especially in extreme political cases, especially where there could be repercussions to free speech. The ability to speak in a way where who you are is not known is valuable. I would even say precious sometimes.
Regarding to the public opinion, the Chinese government new measure is to force the internet users, at least in the major news portals, register with their real identity before they can comment on news or current affairs.
The web is the digital version of capitalism, and social media is the next stage in post-industrial capitalism. And why is it the next stage? Well, it's the digital version. It's the way in which industrial production and industrial society is being replaced by the digital, by globalization, by the virtualization of production, by all the other features and values and ways of organizing that the web is. So I think that that's what's most interesting about the internet as the next stage in capitalism, as a very pure stage, a reflection of a very pure market capitalism, free market capitalism, hostility towards authority, hostility towards the state, hostility towards external laws and organizations.
Google on the internet serves almost the same function as the World Bank in the globe. In other words, Google talks about everything being free, open source, and all shared. Google wants every system to be open. But what Google really wants is every system to be open to Google so that Google can serve ads through every piece of technology. You know, the same way that the World Bank says, oh, we want to give money to all these developing nations as long as they open their markets to first world activity. That means we're going to give them money so that they allow a factory to be open on their land. You know, we're going to give them money so they have the privilege of paying us back with interest.
What do you see happening? What will the outcomes be?
Well, I think that I think the outcome will be one or the other. So it will be that it's likely we either have a far more powerful state that uses technology to control things, which is in some sense a culmination of what's happening in China to some extent, or we have a place where the technology sort of circumvents existing power structures, which I think has been happening in Western Europe and the United States.
What would I say to the people who are sitting in front of their computers, believing in revolution? I think I would say the same thing as those people in the 16th and 17th and 18th century who went to church and who believed in universal redemption or realization in heaven. I believe that they are subjects or victims of false consciousness, that they're wrong, that they're believing in something that doesn't really exist, and they're dupes or they're exploited, particularly those of them who stupidly give away their labor for free so that young men in Silicon Valley can become infinitely rich.
One way of measuring the question about the power of the nation state and the ability of the nation state to project force involves just looking at a map of the world and counting the number of countries in the world. In 1945, when the United Nations got started, I believe there were about 45 or so countries in the world. So they were large countries with large empires. And the history of especially the last 20 or 30 years has involved the collapse of these empires and the creation of more and more countries. So we're at something like 192 countries today. And so they're sort of smaller, generally somewhat weaker, people have more freedoms in them. There are problems with it too, but that's generally been the direction it's gone. And so if we fast forward to the year 2050, one of the questions is, compared to today, will there be more countries, fewer countries, or just the same number? Now, I think it would be very strange if the number of countries in the year 2050 would be exactly 192. I think it's likely to be more or less. And what I'm willing to predict is that if it's more, you'll have a world with greater individual freedom. There may be greater security problems. There may be other problems associated with it. If you have fewer, you'll end up with a world of more government power and less individual freedom.
And you believe that this will be technologically
And technology will decide the question of the number of countries that exist in the world in 2050 more than anything else.